Whenever we learn about a corporate scam or a financial fraud or an investigation by enforcement authorities, we tend to ask, who was the auditor or what was the auditor doing? The National Financial Reporting Authority or NFRA, the independent regulator of the auditing profession in India, has been frequently asking this question and pulling up audit firms. It has penalized and debarred the auditors for their professional misconduct. And it's not just the increased regulatory scrutiny. The audit profession in India has been going through its fair share of headwinds. Audit fees are a contentious issue. The risks of an auditor have gone up. The number of young people interested in taking up the chartered accountancy course is declining. And technology adoption has become a key differentiator. In today's episode of the Morning Brief podcast, I speak to Vishesh Chandiok, CEO Grant Thornton Bharat, a leading consulting firm in India and a founding member firm of the Grant Thornton International Network. Its affiliated audit partner in India is Walker Chandiok and Company. I discuss with Vishesh the state of affairs of the audit profession in India.
We collectively as stakeholders who would like high quality financial reporting need to wake up and smell the coffee.
The surge in forensic audits.
Just because there's a forensic audit or a forensic investigation, it does not mean that already something is wrong.
The red flags.
Promoters have to be very careful about related party transactions. If you're a listed company, minimize them to zero.
The auditor's remuneration.
If the risks have gone up, why should someone be in a risky business if they're not paid really well?
And why should young people study to be a chartered accountant?
I would say to people who are in class 10, class 11, class 12, there isn't a better training than the CA training.
It is Wednesday, April 10th. From the Economic Times, I am your host Kiran Somvanshi, and this is the Morning Brief. Good morning, Vishesh, and welcome to the Morning Brief.
Great to be with you.
I was curious to, see the name of Grant Thornton India changed to Grant Thornton Bharat. Could you please explain why this change?
We keep saying we are an Indian firm first, which is part of a global network. It will always put, India first. Why do we call ourselves Grant Thornton India? How do we position ourselves, position our brand firmly as that India first? Frankly, from the time I co-founded the firm in the year 2000, from that time we used to say our ambition is to help Indian businesses who have global ambitions. And that was the genesis of renaming in August 20 from Grant Thornton India to Grant Thornton Bharat.
Right. Now let's talk about the Indian audit market. How do you see the Indian audit place shaping up, the way it has evolved over the years? What are your observations?
Unlike a lot of the other emerging markets, that we've had a profession for pretty much our entire independent history. If you look at China, there was no profession until I think the 90s, when the so-called equivalent of the CAG office was broken up into private audit firms. So our history is unique, and I have to compliment all the stakeholders who've done a phenomenal job to lay the foundations of the profession in the country. The challenge we have is that we haven't evolved or kept pace with the evolution around the world. There's a lag of some 20 years before, if I can be controversial, almost wake up and smell the coffee and adopt contemporary practices, like the NFRA. The NFRA is the new independent audit regulator since it was effected in the Companies Act 2013, but it took almost 7-8 years after that of pulls and pressures in our vibrant democracy for the NFRA to be formed. They're doing such a fantastic job now, challenging the firms, adopting contemporary practices, as also challenging all the stakeholders on what more they need to do. So I think it's just that lag of 20 years we need to shorten, perhaps to a lag of 2 years, and that's acceptable in a democracy.
Do you see audit firms rising up to the challenges? Or is it going to be regulatory driven and it is going to be the stick approach rather than the carrot approach working?
We collectively, as stakeholders who would like high quality financial reporting, need to wake up and smell the coffee and say, we will not have this long lag between where the world is moved and just sit on our laurels of the past. Understand that the world has moved. The UK has 38 audit firms which audit listed companies. The US has something like 258 audit firms which audit their 7,000 listed companies. Guess how many India has? Something like 12 or 1400, right? So it's a very large number comparatively. And, market cap of our stock markets is about the same as the UK. US is significantly larger market cap of its stock exchanges, 258 versus, let's say, 1258 in India. In India, pretty much anybody who qualifies as a chartered accountant can say that I would like to put myself up to signing off on a listed company audit. Only thing you need is a peer review certificate of the Indian Institute, right? That's the only thing you need. That is not sufficient in today's day and age. The risk those individuals and those firms are taking is not proportionate. And they need to themselves understand, and also not necessarily recognizing what happens when an auditor gets it wrong. What happens when an auditor gets it wrong is some poor widow who has her entire life savings invested in that company or in a mutual fund which has a significant investment loses that. She can't fund her kids' education anymore. It's a massive responsibility that auditors have when you know, say I'm going to sign off on a listed company or a public interest entity. So I think that has to reform in the country. You just can't have 1,200, 1,400 firms, every chartered accountant who wants to sign off on a listed company can do. So we have to change our thinking a little bit away from that socialist thinking that everybody's equal and everybody should have equal opportunity in that
Right.
way.
There has been an increase in the forensic audits which are being done in the country compared to what I used to see earlier 10 years ago. How do you see this trend? Is it, why do we have to have these forensic audits? If auditors did their job well, would not forensic audit wouldn't be required, right? Like, how do you see that?
In my view, forensic audit is a fantastic tool that is available to boards, audit committees, or indeed regulators, etc., when circumstances exist to ask an audit firm to perform additional procedures. An audit isn't meant necessarily to, go into details of those specific aspects. But a forensic audit is a specialism where you get somebody who looks at something with a point of view that, something is wrong. An
Right.
auditor stops at professional skepticism. If an auditor starts, looking at every transaction with a lens of that sort of doubt, you will never finish an audit. You will never get it done. And I think forensic audit is a fantastic tool that's available that isn't used enough by boards, by audit committees, by managements. Some of the reasons why it's not used enough and are, again, for example, now if you do a forensic audit, you need to publicly disclose that, right? You need to inform stock exchanges that you're doing it. I think that's a step too far, right? It's just leading to unintended consequences. And I think, that's the risk we have as a country, that we make laws to try and catch the 1%, right? Somebody who does something wrong intentionally versus what's the appropriate balanced regulation, because that will go against that overall objective of the government, which is lowering cost of doing business and improving ease of doing business.
What have been your observations in terms of the key themes that you see when you do these audits? Are there any common themes which you feel that, okay, if there is a forensic audit, quite likely one, two, three, four flags will be seen?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd say just because there's a forensic audit, it doesn't mean, or a forensic investigation, it does not mean that already something is wrong. I think the biggest common theme, which would you know connect across most of those companies that we looked at, would be related party transactions, right? Transactions between a majority shareholder and controlled enterprises, enterprises outside, which are where the promoter has indirect influence, which they use knowingly or unknowingly to take out money off the main enterprise, right? Rarely, I can tell you, across the forensic audits we looked at, could we find a siphoning of funds outside the enterprise. Very often, yes, money moved from one company to its subsidiary to its associate, which may not necessarily have been why it was borrowed. But very
Right.
rarely did we find money move, banks money move from the enterprise and group into owner hands. So it's a unique case where the promoters have to be very, very, very careful about related party transactions. About, actually, I'd say, if you're a listed company, minimize them to zero. So, owning property and leasing it back to the company, or having transactions between two sets of companies which are independently owned by the promoters, or trying to, hive off pieces of businesses between one company and the other. All those are fraught with all sorts of risks because of that link between ownership and management. The other common theme was, I think, a failure of governance. You know, all lines of defense, right? Boards, audit committees, independent directors, even the regulatory oversight, on companies, of course, auditors, internal auditors, management, all those lines of defense existed, but in whichever way, owners who were CEOs, promoters, managed to override controls, managed to, convince all those lines of defense that all was well when they were, you know, overriding controls. And I think there is a responsibility on the part of everybody to have more skepticism, ask more questions, don't necessarily get influenced by reputation and big names. So investors rely on big name auditors, big name independent directors, high profile companies which are advertising and think this is a great company. Very often it is, but not always. You know,
Right.
boards and independent directors again look at those things. High profile CEO, promoter who's winning awards, etc. Whatever they say is the gospel. Similarly, auditors and our people also get influenced the same way. How can we question somebody who's the promoter when they are saying it is this way? Let's just rely on their representation versus can you please show us the evidence? Because our job is to seek evidence that sits on the file, because an audit is about collecting sufficient, appropriate audit evidence. That is the 101 of auditing.
Right. At several instances, we see the role of the auditor is genuinely questioned. Like, what were the auditors doing? Why didn't they, allow this to happen? Why didn't they not resign? If these things were all there, why the report was not qualified? So finally, when the thing blows up into a scam, that is when these questions are asked. But while the issues are happening, if the auditor is part of that, how do you see his role?
I think we've got to understand that, you know, 99% of cases, there would be probably so much more that will happen if that audit wasn't there. So I'd say, in a large part, the audit profession and all the lines of defense, internal audit, management, internal controls, all those things, regulators, are doing their job in order to protect investors, protect users of financial statements. There is absolutely no question at the same time that the audit profession has to aim on how do we get towards zero defect audit. Right? Zero defect means every time we sign, there will never be a defect. But I don't know a single profession. Is there a hospital that can say every operation I do, I get it right? Every engineer wants to ensure that every building they design, every bridge they build will be resilient forever. But that is not the case. We know that. And I think, again, like in all those professions, those are exceptions. We just have to ensure that as a profession, we are striving to get those exceptions down to zero. We have to come across as being seen to be totally independent, which means we are not doing any non audit services. We are only looking to maximize the value from that audit work and to add value to the client from that audit work. And that's the call we took. Granton Bharat, GT Bharat was the first firm in the country to say this is the way to go. And that was 1st of July 2019, now 5 years ago, that voluntarily, even services that are allowed to be provided under Section 144 of, you know, of the Companies Act in our audit affiliate in India, or GT Bharat with our, under the PCOB standards, we will not provide even permitted non-audit services to our listed audit clients, is the call we took. And that was the reason, because we had to be seen to be independent.
What about the principle of joint audit? Why was there a need to introduce it, and how effective has it been?
Yeah, I think the joint audit, basically what that does is it tries to get two firms or more firms to collectively look at different areas of an audit. What that does is, in my view, changes the power dynamics between the auditor and the auditee, between the company who's being audited and the audit firm. Because when two firms take a particular position, it significantly reduces opinion shopping. Now, you'll ask, what is opinion shopping? Opinion
Exactly.
shopping is when a client says, we don't like your view on how we want to record a particular transaction, but we'll go to X, you know, other firm and get their opinion and give it to you. But what a joint audit does is, when two firms have a certain opinion, then it's quite rare that the client says, let's go to a third firm and get an opinion, right? So it takes out opinion shopping. So why it was introduced, joint audit was always there in PSUs in India, in the public sector banks, in the public sector undertakings. There was a belief in the financial services industry that there was a need to extend some of these changes to the audit world. I think it's gone too far again. Now, if you look at NBFCs, banks, etc., there is a 3-year audit period. There is not a 5+5, which is for all other companies. Maximum term an auditor can do is 3 years. That's too short. By the time you're getting to understand the company, its style, you are done with the audit. Second, there's mandatory joint audit beyond 15,000 crores AUM. Third, the maximum number one firm can take up is 8 NBFCs and 4 banks. So there's a cap on the number you can take on. So it's a combination of very short term, mandatory rotation, and cap per firm. I think all those things are going too far, but that would require some changes. I think 3 things. One, a contemporary joint audit standard, which makes it clear how will joint audit actually work on the ground. So an auditing standard on joint audit, like France has joint audit, look at their standard and adopt that. Second, a maximum limit that there will not be more than 2 joint auditors. There are PSUs which have 5, 10, 15 joint auditors, right? No more than 2, because then there is nobody who has a view on what is happening on the overall enterprise. And third, a tiering of firms so that a tier 1 and tier 2 firm can take on certain kinds of work, tier 2 and tier 3 can take on certain kinds of work, etc., but never tier 1 and tier 4 together, right?
Is there a burden coming in on the last mile worker, the CA intern who is hardly barely, I think, paid? I don't know whether there has been any great revision on the articleship fees, but is that the reason also why less people are enrolling for the course and there is a decline in admissions there?
Oh, there's absolutely no question that the CA trainees in India are paid extremely poorly. The minimum specified by the institute are like minimum wage, pretty much. At the same time, the restrictions on the use of those trainees are so much that I also understand that the firms face huge challenge in getting availability of those trainees. So the trainer, which is the institute, has to remove restrictions of this maximum 35 hours a week. all so many other restrictions there are on how trainees can be used. They have to up the minimum fee, and the firms have to voluntarily up the minimum fee paid to trainees on the back of some of those changes. The trainees have to prioritize the value is in learning in those years of apprenticeship. It is not in passing the exam. You can take 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to pass your exams. I can tell you some of the highest performing people at our firm are those who never pass the exams, right?
We're increasingly seeing that people are preferring to choose MBA finance rather than doing a chartered accountancy course. So,
Oh, there's absolutely no question that there is a huge challenge on attractiveness of the profession, not just in India, but across the world. And the reason for that is, again, there's no single reason, but it includes all this regulatory conversation around what was the auditor doing, the occasional situations where auditors get it wrong and there's regulatory action which goes and picks up auditors from their homes and puts them behind bars even before they have gone through and been held guilty by a court. If the risks have gone up, why should someone be in a risky business if they're not paid really well, right? Outside that, I would say to people who are in class 10, class 11, class 12, there isn't a better training than the CA training. You tell me, in the world of finance, Kiran, is there any other training where you would get the chance from day one, from day one, to start working, to start earning, to start
learning.
practically learning about
Yeah, true.
companies in so many industries, not just companies, all sorts of enterprises. Tell me which MBA is giving you that sort of practical insight to sit with the finance team, to sit with the owner, promoter, manager, and understand businesses across consumer, B2B, steel, cement, banking, aviation. There isn't anything like that. I did that qualification in the UK. I can tell you, I also did a master's in business, effectively an MBA. There is no comparison. There is absolutely no comparison. The MBA is a great top up, but if you look at so many business leaders, Mr. Birla, so many others out there, Mr. Kotak, who have all qualified as chartered accountants and then built amazing enterprises. Many of them didn't do an MBA also.
Right. You mentioned about audit fees. I wanted to understand if for a multinational audit firm or someone who also has global partners, how do you see the audit fees and the quantum of what they are being charged for listed companies, for large companies? Aren't they enough?
One, there is no basis today. It's a contract between a company and the auditor. Very often, the basis is either the previous fee that was being paid or the perception of what tier does the audit firm sit in, right? And unfortunately, in too many cases, for tier two firms to want to come up in tier one, or for tier three firms to want to come up in tier two, perceived tier three, tier two, there's no actual tiering in India. The way to compete is on price. Okay, I'll give you a 20% discount. And in fact, the one great regulation that was there in the code of ethics was that you can't undercut fees to win an audit, right? You can't undercut fees. That was the one edit that was made. I don't understand why. That that whatever a previous auditor was charging, why should a new incoming auditor who's coming in a high inflation environment charge anything low, right? Companies using mandatory firm rotation, etc. Try and say that okay, there are three or four equivalent firms. Let's try and reduce, go to the lowest bidder at this value. We consider all of them technically equal. Now let's try and ask for 10%, 20% reduction, not knowing that if you do that, the firm will cut corners in terms of number of hours, or will have to translate that into lower pay to their people. And if it translates into lower pay for the people, over time, it'll affect the quality of audit. right? Because the people who will be attracted into the profession. So I think that's what I say. I'm talking about the ET article talked about some 10-12% has been the increase in audit fee across the largest listed companies in the country. The top 500 or 1,000 or something. It said 10-12% in a 5-year period. You think yourself, what's been the increase in
Inflation.
costs over that 5-year period, right? So that's why I say it's not enough. A second is there isn't a benchmark. Like in some markets, there is a benchmark. So in Korea, for example, the regulator determines this audit takes 5,000 hours. This audit takes 10,000 hours. This audit takes 15,000. So the regulator specifies the number of hours, right, in their view, and firms then bid for those audits based on their capacity and their tiering.
But can't technology be leveraged to kind of bring down audit costs like we are seeing in different industry? Does it happen?
100%. It's already happening. So I think all the firms are deploying significant analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence kind of technology to ingest data and then run preset routines, right? Which can test, not just test check, but run that routine across the entire data, right? So, say in an audit, you want to see were there any weekend entries passed or entries passed after office hours across the entire general ledger, right? An auditor who to manually go check that would never be able to do it. Today, using technology, you can pretty much run analytics across the entire general ledger, which will tell you, here are 30 entries, 50 entries, which you can then go check. There are many, many ways in which technology is coming in, which is helping go from just test checking to running procedures across a much bigger sample, which leads to a better standard of assurance, a higher level of assurance.
Can technology also be used to kind of prevent fraud detection?
Yeah, of course, 100%. I think the entire genesis of the big fraud that happened in India, uh, and we've seen this ourselves. I remember 10 years ago, a client of ours, a listed company at the time, showed us their entire overseas bank account on a web portal with the balance, and they said the bank confirmation is not coming. Here's the web portal. Somebody had the sense of just checking the website address, didn't appear sensible. Let's just quickly check who this domain belongs to. And it belonged to the promoter CEO's son in their university dorm in America. Right. And I'm not, this is 2010. So that is exactly what happened in that big tech company, Satyam. I can take the name. And absolutely. So as technology comes in, there is all sorts of risks that come up for auditors to gear up to be able to audit. Any big audit today can't be done without cybersecurity involving our cyber teams at firms. And that is why the profession has to evolve and allow multidisciplinary partnerships.
The last thing is, so as an investor or as an industry observer, would like to know what should be the obvious red flags for anyone who's looking at a company either for investment or reviewing or even as a prospective employee joining at a senior level. What are the clear red flags that you see or you probably watch out for?
I think it's the age old saying anything that seems too good to be true is too good to be true. Right. So that's the first thing. So do the smell test. First of all, use your instinct. A lot of us know when something looks inappropriate, but we try and say, no, why not? Let's just see. This looks like a really good opportunity to make money quickly and to ride a wave. But very few things come, at pace. The other questions are basically, is the company really serious about governance and the appropriate governance for the size and scale? If it's a startup, you don't expect them to have, a 8-10 people board with really experienced people with quarterly or more frequent board meetings with really big name auditors, internal auditors, etc. Inappropriate. You don't have to look for that. So everything has to be appropriate for the size and scale. But if you see a really big company with a tiny audit firm, with a family kind of board, with no names you recognize, when you meet the company as a prospective employee or as an investor, ask those questions that for you, who you are with a market cap of 5,000 crores, 20,000 crores, 100,000 crores. How do you practice corporate governance? What role does your board actually play in approving your plans, your strategy, your key decisions? How active is the audit committee at the company? Who really appoints the auditor in this company? So those are the questions to ask. And if you don't, then you got to understand that in today's day and age, the CFO, CEO, other people in the company are all signing off on financials, and they are therefore effectively personally liable.
The NFRA has probably been the best thing that has happened to the audit profession in India in the recent decades. And as Vishesh said, it's time for the audit firms to wake up and smell the coffee in a complex business environment. The industry is going to see consolidation, sophistication, and much more accountability in the coming years. The issues regarding conflict of interest and independence are going to matter more than ever. But audit firms cannot afford to wait for the regulatory whip to crack for them to change. So that's it for today. This is Kiran Somvanshi from the Economic Times, and you are listening all about the Indian audit landscape only on the Morning Brief in conversation with Vishesh Chandiyo, CEO, Grant Thornton Bharat. Vinay Joshi, Amrit Reggie, and Vinayak Agarwal helped produce this episode. Thank you for listening, and if you like this episode, do spread the word. Have a wonderful week ahead.